Picture a vast, wind-swept steppe under a sky so wide it seems to swallow the horizon whole. The year is 1162, and somewhere in the rugged heart of Mongolia, a child is born, a boy whose name would one day echo through the ages, carried on the hooves of 1,000,000 horses. His story is one of hardship, ambition, and conquest, a tale that reshaped the world. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of your evening, let me guide you through the life of Genghis Khan, the warrior who forged an empire larger than any before or since. This is not just a history lesson. It's a journey across endless plains, through battles and betrayals, triumphs and tragedies, all woven into a story to carry you gently towards sleep. Imagine the crackle of a distant fire, the soft hum of the wind, and the steady rhythm of hooves as we travel back to a time when survival demanded cunning, and destiny was written in blood and stars. This video is crafted for those who love history, for those who find peace in the cadence of a story well told, and for those who seek a moment of calm before drifting off. Whether you're tucked into bed, winding down after a long day, or simply curious about the man behind the legend, this tale is for you. I'd love to know, where are you watching this from? What time is it there? Drop a comment below to share, and if you enjoy this journey, please give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Your support keeps this channel alive, bringing more tales to light your evenings. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. Under a sky bruised with the first light of dawn, the Mongolian steppe stretched endlessly, a sea of grass that whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. It was here, in the year 1162, that a boy named Temujin drew his first breath, born into a world where survival was a daily wager against the elements, rival tribes, and the caprice of fate. The steppe was no cradle for the faint-hearted. Its winds howled with a ferocity that could strip a man's spirit bare, and its winters buried hope beneath blankets of snow. Yet it was this unforgiving land that would forge a child into a legend, a boy who would one day be called Genghis Khan. Temujin's birth was not heralded by fanfare or prophecy, but by the quiet resilience of his mother, Holun, a woman whose strength was as unyielding as the mountains that loomed in the distance. His father, Yesujay, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of modest influence among the fractious Mongol tribes. The Borjigins were nomads, their lives tethered to the rhythms of their herds, moving with the seasons across the vast plains. To be born into such a world was to inherit both freedom and peril. The steppe offered no walls for protection, no fields to guarantee a harvest, only the promise of struggle and the faint hope of glory. The Mongolia of Temujin's childhood was a tapestry of rivalries, woven with threads of loyalty and betrayal. Tribes like the Merkits, the Tatars, and the Karaids roamed the same lands, their alliances as shifting as the sands of the Gobi. A chieftain's power rested not on gold or stone, but on the strength of his warriors and the trust of his kin. Yesujay, Temujin's father, was a man skilled in this delicate dance of power. He was no stranger to raids, forging bonds through marriage or battle, and his union with Holun was itself a tale of conquest. Kidnapped from her Merkit husband, Holun was brought to Yesujay's camp, her defiance tempered by the need to survive. In time, she bore him sons, and Temujin, their firstborn, carried the weight of their ambitions. Life on the steppe demanded resilience from even the youngest. Temujin, barely old enough to ride, learned to grip a bow, to track a deer through the tall grass, to read the stars that guided his people through moonless nights. The Mongols were horsemen born, their lives intertwined with the sturdy ponies that carried them to war and pasture alike. A boy's worth was measured by his ability to ride, to shoot, to endure. Temujin's small hands, calloused from reins and bowstrings, were already learning the tools of survival. Yet, beyond the skills of a nomad, there was something else in him. A spark, a quiet intensity that flickered in his dark eyes, unnoticed by most but destined to set the world ablaze. The steppe was not just a landscape, it was a crucible. Every day brought lessons in survival, from the sting of a winter storm to the constant threat of rival tribes. Raids were common, and no camp was truly safe. A single night could bring the thunder of hooves, the flash of steel, and the loss of everything. herds, tents, even family. Temujin grew up hearing tales of great Khans who had united tribes in the past, only to see their dreams unravel in the chaos of betrayal. These stories, told by firelight, planted seeds in his young mind, seeds that would one day grow into a vision far greater than any his people had known. But the steppe was also a place of beauty, where the dawn painted the grass gold and the night sky unfurled like a tapestry of stars. Temujin, as a boy, would have lain beneath that sky, listening to the wind carry the songs of his people, songs of warriors, of ancestors, of spirits that dwelled in the mountains and rivers. The Mongols revered the eternal blue sky, Tengri, as their guiding deity, and its vastness seemed to whisper to Temujin of possibilities beyond the horizon. Even as a child, he sensed that his life would not be confined to the small world of his clan. There was a hunger in him, not just for survival, but for something greater, a destiny he could not yet name. Yet, for all its harshness, the steppe was also a place of community. Temujin's early years were shaped by the bonds of family. His mother, Holun, was a figure of quiet ferocity, teaching her children to hold fast to one another in a world that offered no guarantees. His younger siblings, brothers Kasar, Kachian, and Temuj, and sister Temulin, were his first allies, their loyalty forged in the shared trials of childhood. Yasujay, too, played a pivotal role, teaching his son the art of leadership, though his time with Temujin would be cut short. The boy's world, though small, was rich with the warmth of kinship, a warmth that would anchor him through the storms to come. As Temujin grew, so did the shadows around him. The steppe was a land of fleeting alliances, and even a chieftain's son was not safe from its cruelties. The Mongols were not a united people. They were a mosaic of clans, each vying for dominance, each ready to exploit weakness. Temujin's father had enemies, and those enemies cast long shadows. A single act of betrayal, a single moment of trust misplaced, could unravel everything. As the boy stood on the cusp of manhood, the world he knew was about to fracture, and the lessons of the steppe, resilience, cunning, endurance, would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. What lay ahead for young Temujin was a trial that would break most men, a crucible of loss and survival that would set him on a path toward greatness. But as the stars wheeled above the steppe, and the wind sang its ancient song, the boy slept, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon, a storm that would shape not just his life, but the fate of empires. The Mongolian steppe, with its endless sweep of grass and sky, was a place where life hung in delicate balance, where the warmth of a family's fire could be snuffed out by a single act of treachery. For young Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, these early years were shaped by two towering figures. His father, Yasujay, whose ambition cast a long shadow, and his mother, Holun, whose unyielding strength held their fragile world together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the steppe in hues of amber and violet, Temujin's childhood was a tapestry of lessons, some taught by love, others by loss, that would carve the path to his destiny. Yasujay, Temujin's father, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man whose name carried weight among the scattered Mongol tribes. He was not a king, nor a ruler of vast lands, but a leader whose power rested on his ability to command loyalty and wield a sword. Yasujay was a warrior of the old ways, skilled in the art of the raid, where speed and cunning could win a man herds, wives, or glory. His marriage to Holun, stolen from a Merkit rival, was a testament to his boldness, but it also sowed the seeds of enmity that would haunt his family. To Temujin, Yasujay was a figure larger than life, a man who rode with the wind, whose laughter boomed like thunder, and whose stories of ancient Khans filled the boy's dreams with visions of greatness. In the felt-lined walls of their jur, the Mongol tent that was both home and sanctuary, Yasujay taught his son the ways of the steppe. Temujin learned to read the land, how to find water in a dry valley, how to track a wolf by its prints, how to judge a man's heart by the set of his eyes. But more than that, Yasujay taught him the delicate dance of alliances. The Mongols were not a united people. Their tribes were as likely to raid each other as to share a fire. A chieftain's strength lay in his ability to bind men to his cause through marriage, blood oaths, or the promise of plunder. At 9 years old, Temujin was already being groomed for this world, his father arranging a betrothal to Bert, a girl from the Angjarat tribe, to secure an alliance that could strengthen the Borjigins. Yet the steppe was a place of shadows, and Yesujay's ambitions made enemies. The Tatars, a rival tribe, bore a grudge from old feuds, their hatred simmering like a storm on the horizon. It was during a journey to seal Temujin's betrothal that fate turned cruel. Yesujay, weary from travel, accepted hospitality from a group of strangers, a fatal mistake. The meal they shared was laced with poison, a coward's weapon that stole the chieftain's strength. As he lay dying, his thoughts turned to his son, left vulnerable in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. Temujin, barely a boy, was thrust into a storm he was not yet ready to face. Holun, Temujin's mother, became the anchor of their fractured family. A woman of iron resolve, she had known hardship long before Yesujay's death. Kidnapped from her first husband, she had learned to navigate the steppe's brutal realities, turning her pain into strength. Now, widowed with 5 young children, Holun faced a world that cared little for a leaderless clan. The Borjigins' allies, sensing weakness, began to drift away, and the tribe's elders, led by the cunning Targutai, turned their backs on Yesujay's family. They saw no future in a boy too young to wield a sword or command warriors. The jur that had once been filled with laughter now echoed with the weight of abandonment. Holun's strength was a beacon in those dark days. She gathered her children, Temujin, his brothers Kasar, Kachian, and Temuj, and their sister Temulin, and fought to keep them alive. The steppe offered no charity, food was scarce, and winter was a relentless enemy. Holun taught her children to forage for roots, to fish in icy streams, to hunt small game with makeshift traps. She told them stories of their ancestors, warriors who had defied the odds, and her voice carried a fire that kept despair at bay. To Temujin, his mother was more than a protector. She was a teacher, instilling in him a fierce will to survive and a belief that loyalty, above all, was the foundation of strength. But survival came at a cost. The loss of Yesujay left Temujin with a wound that would never fully heal. He was a boy marked by betrayal, abandoned by those his father had trusted. The steppe, once a place of freedom, now felt like a cage, its vastness hiding dangers at every turn. Temujin learned to watch the horizon, to listen for the faint rumble of hooves, to trust only those closest to him. His brothers became his first warriors, their bond forged in hunger and hardship. Yet even within the family, tensions simmered. Temujin's half-brother, Bektar, older and ambitious, began to challenge his authority, planting the seeds of a conflict that would test the limits of kinship. Holun's lessons extended beyond survival. She taught Temujin to see the steppe not as a prison, but as a canvas for ambition. "The sky is vast," she would say, "and it watches all men equally. Make it your strength." These words, spoken in the flicker of a dying fire, took root in Temujin's heart. He began to dream not just of survival, but of power, of a day when he would no longer be prey, but predator. The steppe had taken his father, his safety, his innocence, but it had given him something else, a hunger that burned brighter with each passing day. As the years passed, Temujin grew taller, his frame lean but wiry, his eyes sharp with the weight of lessons learned too young. The steppe had shaped him, but it was Holun's strength and Yesujay's shadow that gave him purpose. He was no longer just a boy, he was a spark waiting to ignite. But the steppe was not done with him yet. A new trial loomed, one that would push him to the edge of survival and force him to confront the darkness within himself. As the stars glittered above, cold and unyielding, Temujin stood at the threshold of a life he could not yet fathom, a life that would demand everything he had and more. What would become of this boy, abandoned by his tribe, hunted by his enemies, and driven by a mother's unyielding love? The answer lay in the trials to come, trials that would test not just his strength, but the very core of his soul. The steppe stretched endlessly before the small cluster of jurs, their felt walls trembling in the wind that swept down from the northern mountains. For young Temujin, now a boy of barely 10 winters, the world had grown smaller, sharper, more perilous. The death of his father, Yesujay, had ripped the fragile threads that held his family's place among the Borjigin clan. Once respected as the kin of a chieftain, Temujin, His mother Holon and his siblings were now outcasts, abandoned by those who had once sworn loyalty. The steppe, with its vast skies and whispering grasses, was a land of beauty, but also of betrayal. A lesson Temujin would learn in the crucible of hardship, one that would carve his name into the annals of history. The betrayal came swiftly, like a wolf striking in the night. After Yesujay's death, the Borjigin clan, led by the ambitious Targutai, turned their backs on Holon and her children. To the elders, Temujin was no leader, just a boy, too young to wield a bow in battle or command the respect of warriors. The clan's herds, their lifeblood, were divided among the stronger families, and Holon's small family was left with little more than a single jur and a handful of horses. The steppe was unforgiving to those without protection, and the Borjigins' departure was a death sentence, cloaked in the guise of tradition. "A chieftain's widow cannot lead," they said, their voices cold as the winter frost. And so they rode away, leaving Temujin's family to the mercy of the wild. Holon's defiance was a fire that refused to be extinguished. She stood tall, her eyes blazing as she gathered her children close, vowing to protect them against a world that had turned its back. But survival was a daily battle. The steppe offered no charity, no fields to sow, no walls to shield them from raiders. Holon led her family to the margins of the land, to the valleys where the Anan River carved its slow path through the grass. There they scratched out a living, foraging for wild onions, digging for roots, and hunting small game. Temujin, his brothers, and his sister Temulin learned to move silently, to watch the horizon for danger, to sleep with one eye open. The steppe had become both their home and their enemy. But the true sting of betrayal came not from the clan's abandonment, but from the hands of enemies old and new. The Tatars, who had poisoned Yesujay, were not content to let his family fade into obscurity. Their hatred lingered, a grudge born of old raids and stolen honor. Word spread that Yesujay's widow and children were alone, vulnerable, a prize for any who sought to settle scores. Worse still, the Merkits, Holon's former people, nursed their own vendetta. Yesujay had stolen her from them years before, and now, with no chieftain to protect her, they saw a chance for revenge. The steppe was a land where grudges were paid in blood, and Temujin's family was a target. It was in this shadow of danger that Temujin faced his first true test. The Merkits came in the dead of night, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth, their torches flickering like malevolent stars. Holon, ever vigilant, woke her children, urging them to flee into the hills. Temujin, his heart pounding, scrambled up the rocky slopes, his younger brothers at his heels. But not all could escape. The Merkits seized Holon's eldest son, Bekter, and Temujin's half-brother, Belgute, as well as some of their meager possessions. Temujin, hidden in the shadows, watched helplessly as the raiders vanished into the night, their laughter a cruel echo across the steppe. The pain of that moment, the powerlessness, the fear, seared itself into his soul. The years that followed were a crucible of endurance. Temujin and his family lived like ghosts, moving from one hiding place to another, always wary of the next raid. Hunger was a constant companion, its ache a reminder of their isolation. Temujin, now the eldest male in the family, felt the weight of responsibility settle on his young shoulders. Holon's strength sustained them, but it was Temujin who began to take on the role of protector. He learned to set traps for marmots, to fish with his hands in icy streams, to read the tracks of both beasts and men. His brothers, Kasar and Kachian, looked to him for guidance, their loyalty a fragile thread in a world that seemed determined to break them. Yet, even within the family, betrayal simmered. Bekter, Temujin's half-brother, had returned from captivity, but his time among the Merkits had hardened him. Older and stronger than Temujin, Bekter began to assert his own claim to leadership, challenging his younger brother's authority. The tension between them grew, a silent storm brewing in the cramped confines of their jur. One day, by the banks of the Anan, the conflict erupted. In a moment of rage and desperation, Temujin and Kasar confronted Bekter, their argument escalating into a deadly clash. When the dust settled, Bekter lay dead, killed by his own brothers. Holon's grief was a thunderclap, her anger a warning to Temujin. "You have killed your brother, your own blood. What will you become?" The act was a stain on his soul, but it was also a declaration. A boy stepping into the shadow of a man, willing to do whatever it took to protect his family. The step had taught Temujin that trust was a luxury, that survival demanded a heart both fierce and guarded. He began to see the world through new eyes, not as a place of endless freedom, but as a battlefield where only the cunning and the strong could prevail. The betrayal of his clan, the raids of his enemies, and the blood on his hands had changed him. He was no longer just a boy struggling to survive. He was a spark, ready to ignite. But the step was not done testing him. A greater trial loomed, one that would strip him of everything and force him to confront the depths of his own resilience. As the wind howled across the steppe, carrying the whispers of a world on the edge of change, Temujin stood alone, his eyes fixed on the horizon. What lay beyond those endless plains? A life of hiding, or a destiny that would shake the earth? The answer was coming, carried on the hooves of those who sought to chain him. The steppe was a land of whispers and shadows, where the wind carried both the songs of the past and the warnings of dangers yet to come. For Temujin, now a youth hardened by betrayal and loss, the world was a tapestry of fleeting alliances and lurking threats. The death of his half-brother Bektar had left a scar on his soul, a reminder that even blood could not always be trusted. Yet in the flickering light of his family's fire, Temujin found something stronger than betrayal: the bonds of brotherhood, forged in the crucible of survival. These bonds, with his brothers and a friend who would become both ally and rival, would shape the path of the boy who would one day be Genghis Khan. Temujin's family, cast out by their clan, lived on the fringes of the steppe, their lives a delicate balance between hunger and hope. His mother, Holan, remained the unyielding heart of their small band, but it was Temujin who began to take on the mantle of leadership. His brothers Kasar, Kachian, and Temuj were his first followers, their loyalty rooted in the shared trials of their childhood. Kasar, the next eldest, was a skilled archer, his quiet strength a steady presence. Kachian, quick-witted and fierce, shared Temujin's hunger for something greater than survival. Temuj, the youngest, was still a child, but his wide eyes watched his eldest brother with awe. Together, they were a unit, bound by the unspoken vow to protect one another against a world that had shown them little mercy. Life on the margins of the steppe was a school of hard lessons. The family moved often, their jur a solitary speck against the vast grasslands, always wary of raiders who saw weakness in their isolation. Temujin taught his brothers to ride as if their lives depended on it, because they often did. He showed them how to loose an arrow from horseback, how to vanish into the folds of the hills, how to read the subtle signs of an approaching enemy. These were not just skills, they were the currency of survival, paid in sweat and vigilance. Around the fire at night, Temujin wove stories of their ancestors, of Khans who had ridden under the eternal blue sky, their names carried on the wind. These tales were not just comfort, they were a promise, a spark of ambition that burned brighter with each telling. But the steppe was not a place where a boy could rely solely on family. To survive, Temujin needed allies beyond the walls of their jur. It was in these years that he forged a bond that would define his early life. A friendship with Jamaka, a boy from the Jadaran tribe, a distant kin of the Mongols. Jamaka was no ordinary companion. Like Temujin, he was a son of the steppe, his spirit as wild as the horses they rode. The two met as boys, their paths crossing during a chance encounter on the plains. They shared a fire, traded stories, and in a solemn moment under the stars, swore an oath of Anda, blood brotherhood. They exchanged gifts, a knucklebone from Temujin, a small carving from Jamaka, sealing their bond with the weight of tradition. To be Anda was to be closer than kin, to share a destiny as one. Together, Temujin and Jamaka were a force of youth and fire. They hunted together, their arrows finding deer in the thickets of the Anan Valley. They raced their horses across the steppe, their laughter echoing in the vast silence. Jamaka was a mirror to Temujin, bold, cunning, and driven by a vision of his own. Where Temujin was intense, his eyes burning with unspoken dreams, Jamaka was charismatic, his words weaving loyalty from those around him. For a time, their friendship was a refuge, a reminder that the steppe could offer more than betrayal. They spoke of uniting the tribes, of ending the endless cycle of raids and vendettas, of forging a world where strength was shared, not stolen. Yet, even in this bond, the seeds of discord were sown. Jamaka, like Temujin, was a leader by nature, and the steppe was too small for two such ambitions. Their friendship, though deep, was fragile, built on the shifting sands of youth and ideals. The steppe demanded loyalty, but it also rewarded power, and the clash between the two was inevitable. For now, though they were brothers, their laughter a fleeting defiance against the hardships of their world. Temujin, still haunted by the betrayal of his clan and the loss of his father, found in Jamaka a spark of hope, a belief that he could build something greater than himself. The years of Temujin's youth were not without moments of beauty. The steppe, for all its cruelty, was a canvas of wonder. Dawn broke with a golden fire, painting the grass in hues of amber and green. At night, the stars hung low, as if the eternal blue sky itself was watching. Temujin and his brothers would lie beneath that sky, their breath visible in the cold air, dreaming of a future where they were not hunted, but hunters. These moments, fleeting as they were, gave Temujin strength. He began to see the steppe not as a prison, but as a stage, a vast, untamed world waiting for someone bold enough to claim it. But the steppe was never still, and danger was never far. The Merkits, who had raided Temujin's family years before, had not forgotten their grudge. Their eyes were fixed on Holan's son, the boy who carried Yesujay's name. One night, as the family slept, the sound of hooves shattered the silence. The Merkits had returned, their intent clear, to crush the last remnants of Yesujay's line. Temujin, now a teenager, fled into the hills, his heart pounding as he hid among the rocks. But this time, the raiders took something more precious than possessions. They took Bert, the girl betrothed to him, the promise of his future. As the dust settled and the Merkit riders vanished into the darkness, Temujin emerged from his hiding place, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with a fire that would not be quenched. The loss of Bert was a wound deeper than any Temujin had known. It was not just a personal loss, but a challenge to his honor, a test of his strength. Alone on the steppe, with only his brothers and the memory of Jamaka's oath, he faced a choice: to remain a fugitive or to fight for what was his. The wind howled, carrying the whispers of the spirits, and Temujin knew that his path was set. The boy who had been betrayed, who had lost everything, was about to take his first step toward becoming something more: a leader, a warrior, a Khan. What would Temujin do to reclaim what was stolen? How would the bonds of brotherhood with his kin and with Jamaka shape the man he was becoming? The steppe held its breath, waiting for the spark to ignite. The steppe was a land of stark contrasts, where the golden light of dawn could give way to the cold shadow of loss in an instant. For Temujin, now a young man tempered by the fires of betrayal and survival, the world had taught him that nothing was certain, not family, not allies, not even the fragile dreams of youth. Yet amidst the harshness of the steppe, there was one bond that anchored him, one light that refused to be extinguished. His love for Bert, the girl promised to him in childhood, now stolen by the Merkits in a raid that cut deeper than any blade. As the stars glittered above the endless plains, Temujin stood at a crossroads, his heart burning with a resolve that would shape not only his future, but the fate of empires. Bert had been more than a betrothal arranged by his father, Yesujay. Even as children, when they met in the camp of the Angjarat tribe, there was a spark between them, a quiet understanding that transcended the politics of alliance. Bert was no ordinary girl. Her eyes held a wisdom born of the steppe's trials, her spirit as resilient as the tough grasses that bent but never broke in the wind. To Temujin, she was a partner, a confidant, a promise of a life beyond mere survival. Their betrothal, sealed when he was just 9, was a bond that carried the weight of his father's hopes. But it was their shared moments, brief, stolen glances under the watchful eyes of their families, that kindled something deeper. The Merkit raid had shattered that promise. In the dead of night, as Temujin and his brothers fled into the hills, the raiders had taken Bert, dragging her away to their distant camps. The image of her, torn from the safety of their jur, haunted Temujin's dreams. The steppe, with its vast indifference, offered no answers, only the echo of his own failure to protect her. For a young man who had already lost his father, his clan, and his sense of security, this loss was a wound that threatened to break him. Yet, it was also a fire, kindling a determination that would set him apart from the boy he had been. Temujin knew he could not reclaim Bert alone. The Merkits were a powerful tribe, their warriors seasoned and their camps well defended. He was a fugitive, a leader of nothing but a handful of loyal brothers and a mother whose strength was a beacon, but not enough to challenge an enemy. To rescue Bert, he needed allies, and so he turned to the one bond that still held firm. His blood brother, Jamaka, and the distant memory of his father's old ally, Togrul, the Khan of the Karyid tribe. These were men of power, men who could tip the scales, but to seek their aid was to walk a dangerous path, for alliances on the steppe were as fragile as a spider's web. Jamaka, Temujin's Anda, was the first to answer his call. Their bond, forged in the innocence of youth, still held a flicker of warmth, though the years had begun to cast shadows between them. Jamaka, now a rising leader among the Jadaran, brought with him a band of warriors, their horses swift and their bows deadly. His presence was a reminder of their shared dreams, of a time when they had spoken of uniting the tribes under a single banner. "We are brothers," Jamaka said, his voice steady as they sat by a fire on the steppe. "Your loss is mine." Temujin, his heart heavy with gratitude and suspicion, nodded, knowing that even brotherhood could carry a price. Togrul, the Karyid Khan, was a harder man to sway. He had been Yesujay's ally, bound by old oaths, but the steppe was a place where memory faded faster than honor. Togrul was a ruler of wealth and influence, his tribe a force to be reckoned with. To approach him was to risk rejection or worse, betrayal. Yet Temujin, driven by his love for Bert, rode to the Karyid camp, his brothers at his side, and knelt before the Khan. He spoke not of power or ambition, but of loyalty, of the debt Togrul owed his father. "I am Yesujay's son," he said, his voice steady despite his youth. "Help me reclaim what is mine, and I will be your shield." Togrul, moved by the boy's fire and perhaps by the ghost of old promises, agreed to lend his warriors. The campaign to rescue Bert was Temujin's first true test as a leader. With Jamaka and Togrul's forces, he gathered a small but fierce army, their hooves shaking the earth as they rode toward the Merkit camps. The steppe, vast and unyielding, was both ally and enemy, its open plains offering no cover but its rivers and hills providing paths for ambush. Temujin, though young, showed a mind for strategy, guiding his men with a precision that belied his years. Under the cover of darkness, they struck, their arrows singing through the air, their horses a thunder that scattered the Merkit guards. The camp erupted in chaos, and in the midst of it, Temujin found Bert, her face pale but her eyes unbroken. The reunion was a moment of quiet triumph, a rare softness in a life of sharp edges. Bert, though marked by her ordeal, stood tall, her strength a mirror to Temujin's own. She had endured captivity, uncertainty, and the weight of a future stolen, yet her spirit remained unbroken. As they rode back to their small camp, her hand in his, Temujin felt a new resolve take root. Bert was not just his wife. She was his partner, a woman whose counsel would shape his path as much as any sword or bow. Their love, forged in the fires of adversity, was a bond that would endure the trials to come. But the victory was not without cost. Jamaka's aid had been invaluable, but his ambition was a shadow that loomed larger with each passing day. Togrul's support came with the weight of obligation, a debt that Temujin knew he would one day have to repay. The steppe was a land where every favor was a chain, every alliance a gamble. As Temujin looked to the horizon, Bert at his side, he saw not just the promise of a future, but the gathering storm of rivalry and ambition. The boy who had fought to reclaim his love was now a man with enemies and allies who would test the limits of his strength. What would become of this fragile alliance, this brotherhood strained by the weight of dreams too big for the steppe to hold? As the wind whispered across the grass, carrying the scent of distant battles, Temujin's heartbeat with a rhythm that echoed the hooves of 1,000 horses, ready to ride toward a destiny that was only just beginning to take shape. The steppe stretched beneath a sky heavy with stars, each one a silent witness to the dreams and struggles of those who roamed below. For Temujin, Now a young man reunited with his beloved Bert, the world was no longer just a place of survival. It was a canvas for ambition, a vast expanse where a man with vision could carve his name. The rescue of Bert had been more than a personal triumph. It was a spark that lit the fire of leadership within him. With his family by his side and the fragile alliances with Jamaka and Togrul still holding, Temujin began to see a future beyond the endless cycle of raids and betrayal. As the wind whispered through the grasses, it carried a new song, one of unity, of strength, of a boy becoming a leader who would one day shake the earth. The steppe was a land of scattered tribes, each bound by its own loyalties, each wary of the other. The Mongols, the Karaids, the Merkits, the Tatars, all lived in a delicate balance of power, their alliances shifting like the sands of the Gobi. To Temujin, this was not just chaos, it was opportunity. The betrayal of his clan after his father's death had taught him that loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be earned, forged through trust and shared purpose. He looked at the fractured tribes around him and saw not enemies, but men who could be bound together, men who could share a single dream. But to lead them, he needed more than courage. He needed charisma, cunning, and a vision that could outshine the steppe's endless horizon. Temujin's first steps toward leadership were small, but deliberate. He began with those closest to him, his brothers, Kasar, Kachian, and Temuj, who had stood by him through hunger and danger. They were his foundation, their loyalty a rock in the shifting sands of the steppe. Bert, too, was more than a wife. Her wisdom and resolve became his compass, guiding him through decisions that would shape their future. Together, they moved their small camp to the banks of the Anan River, a place where the water ran clear and the hills offered protection. It was here, in the shadow of the Barhin Haldun mountain, that Temujin began to build something new, a following, a tribe of his own. His first followers were not warriors of renown, but outcasts like himself, men and women who had been cast aside by their clans, wanderers who sought a leader to give them purpose. Temujin welcomed them, not as servants, but as equals, offering them a place by his fire and a share of whatever meager spoils they had. He listened to their stories, learned their names, and shared their burdens. This was no small thing on the steppe, where chieftains often ruled through fear. Temujin's strength was not just in his bow or his horse, but in his ability to see the worth in every man, to bind them to him with something stronger than fear. Hope. He spoke of a future where no tribe would raid another, where the Mongols could stand as one under the eternal blue sky. Word of Temujin's growing band spread across the steppe, carried by traders, herders, and the wind itself. Men came to him, some out of curiosity, others out of desperation. There was Jelmi, a young warrior whose father had been slain by the Tatars, his eyes burning with a hunger for revenge. There was Subutai, a boy barely old enough to ride, but with a mind sharp enough to outwit a fox. These were not the sons of chieftains, but Temujin saw in them what others did not, potential. He trained them, not just to fight, but to think, to plan, to see the steppe as a battlefield where strategy could triumph over numbers. Under his guidance, they learned to move as one, their horses a single thunder, their arrows a storm that could break any foe. But leadership was not just about gathering men, it was about holding them. The steppe was a place of temptation, where a single promise of wealth or safety could lure men away. Temujin knew this, and so he built his tribe on a foundation of loyalty. He shared his meals with his followers, gave them the best horses, and stood beside them in every raid. When a man fell in battle, Temujin mourned him as a brother, ensuring his family was cared for. This was a new kind of leadership, one that turned strangers into kin, and it drew more to his banner. Slowly, his camp grew, the jurs multiplying along the river, the smoke of their fires rising like a challenge to the sky. Yet, Temujin's rise did not go unnoticed. The steppe was a land of watchful eyes, and his growing power stirred both allies and enemies. Togrul, the Karaid Khan who had aided in Bert's rescue, began to see Temujin not as a grateful youth, but as a potential rival. Jamaka, his blood brother, rode with him still, but their conversations grew strained, their laughter less frequent. Jamaka, too, had ambitions, and the steppe was not a place where two sons could shine equally. The bond of their anda, once a source of strength, was beginning to fray under the weight of unspoken dreams. The steppe itself seemed to sense the change. The grasses whispered of battles to come, of hooves that would shake the earth, of a man whose name would echo beyond the horizon. Temujin, now in his early 20s, stood taller, his frame lean but strong, his eyes sharp with a vision that saw beyond the next hill. He was no longer just a boy fighting to survive. He was a leader, a man who could bend the steppe to his will. But the path to power was fraught with danger. Every new follower brought strength, but also risk. Every alliance carried the shadow of betrayal. And somewhere in the vastness of the steppe, old enemies, the Merkits, the Tatars, watched and waited, their grudges as sharp as their blades. As Temujin stood by the Anan, watching the river reflect the stars, he felt the weight of his destiny. Bert, at his side, spoke softly of the future, her words a reminder that their love was the anchor that kept him grounded. But the steppe was restless, and the bonds he had forged, with his brothers, his followers, his Anda, would soon be tested. A storm was gathering, not of wind or rain, but of ambition and rivalry, and Temujin would need all his cunning to navigate it. The boy who had once hidden in the hills was gone. In his place stood a man ready to claim the steppe, or lose everything trying. What would happen when the bonds of brotherhood clashed with the hunger for power? As the stars wheeled above, their light cold and unyielding, the steppe held its breath, waiting for the spark that would set it ablaze. The steppe lay quiet under a twilight sky, its grasses swaying like a sea caught in a restless dream. For Temujin, now a young leader with a growing band of followers, the world was no longer just a place of survival. It was a chessboard, where every move carried the weight of destiny. His small tribe, bound by loyalty and the promise of a greater future, had begun to draw eyes across the plains. Men whispered his name by their fires, some with hope, others with fear. But the strongest bond in Temujin's life, the oath of Anda with his blood brother Jamaka, was beginning to fray. As the stars emerged, cold and distant, a rift was forming, one that would test Temujin's heart and set the steppe on a path toward war. Jamaka, Temujin's sworn brother, was a man of charisma and fire, his spirit as wild as the horses that thundered across the plains. Their bond had been forged in youth, sealed with gifts and promises under the eternal blue sky. Together they had dreamed of a steppe united, free from the endless cycle of raids and betrayals. They had fought side by side to rescue Bert, their arrows flying as one, their laughter mingling in the wind. But dreams, like the steppe's fleeting rains, could dry up under the harsh light of ambition. Jamaka, like Temujin, was a leader, and the steppe was not a place where two men could share the same crown. The seeds of discord were subtle at first, like cracks in a frozen river. Temujin's growing following, outcasts, warriors, and families who saw in him a new kind of leader, began to rival Jamaka's own. Where Temujin welcomed all, regardless of birth, and shared his fire with the lowliest herder, Jamaka held to the old ways, favoring the sons of chieftains and the bloodlines of power. Their visions for the future diverged. Temujin saw a steppe where loyalty trumped lineage, where a man's worth was proven by his deeds. Jamaka saw a world where order came from tradition, where the strong ruled by right of birth. These differences, small at first, grew into a chasm neither could bridge. The breaking point came during a shared camp along the Anan River. Temujin and Jamaka, their tribes united for a season, rode together, their jurs a sprawling testament to their strength. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Jamaka, ever the orator, spoke of the past of Khans who had ruled with iron and blood. Temujin, his eyes fixed on the horizon, spoke of a future where no tribe would fear another. One evening, as they sat by a fire, Jamaka made a proposal: to ride together, to share leadership, to bind their tribes as one. But his words carried a challenge, a subtle demand for Temujin to bend to his vision. Temujin, his heart stirred by Bert's quiet counsel, refused to yield. "The sky is one," he said, "but it needs only one sun." The camp, once filled with the warmth of brotherhood, grew cold. Whispers spread among the warriors, loyalties splitting like a river forking in the plains. Some were drawn to Jamaka's charm, his promise of a return to the old ways. Others saw in Temujin a fire that could reshape the world. The final break came in the night, as Temujin's followers packed their jurs and rode away, choosing to follow the man who had shared their hunger, their dreams. Jamaka, left with his own tribe, watched them go, his face a mask of pride and pain. The bond of Anda, once stronger than blood, was shattered, not by a single betrayal, but by the weight of two dreams too vast to coexist. Temujin's heart was heavy as he led his people away, the hoofbeats of their horses a mournful drum. Bert, riding at his side, spoke softly, her words a balm. "You cannot hold a man whose heart seeks a different path." But the loss of Jamaka was more than the loss of a friend. It was the loss of a brother, a piece of his youth. Yet the steppe had no room for regret. Temujin knew that Jamaka's ambition would not rest, that their paths would cross again, not as allies, but as rivals. The steppe was a land where loyalty was tested by fire, and Temujin's fire burned brighter than ever. He turned his focus to his people, strengthening the bonds that held them together. His brothers, Kasar, Kachian, and Temuj, remained his rock, their loyalty unwavering. His followers, now numbering in the hundreds, looked to him not just as a leader, but as a beacon. Temujin rewarded their faith with fairness, sharing spoils equally, remembering names, and sitting with them in the dust and cold. He began to forge a new kind of tribe, one where a man's worth was measured not by his birth, but by his courage and loyalty. Warriors like Gelmi and Subutai, who had joined him in his youth, became his trusted lieutenants, their minds as sharp as their blades. But the steppe was watching. Togrul, the Karayid Khan who had once aided Temujin, grew wary of his rising star. The Merkits and Tatars, old enemies, sharpened their knives, sensing a threat in the young leader's growing power. And Jamaka, now a rival, was gathering his own forces, his charisma drawing tribes to his banner. The steppe, once a place of scattered fires, was beginning to glow with the embers of war. Temujin, standing on a hill overlooking his camp, felt the weight of what was to come. The boy who had hidden in the hills was gone. In his place stood a man whose name was beginning to echo across the plains. As the wind carried the scent of distant storms, Temujin looked to the stars, seeking the guidance of the eternal blue sky. Bert, her hand in his, whispered of the future, of a world where their children could live without fear. But the path to that future was paved with conflict, and the rift with Jamaka was only the beginning. A greater challenge loomed, one that would test Temujin's strength, his cunning, and the loyalty of those who followed him. The steppe was a crucible, and the fire was about to burn hotter than ever. What would happen when Temujin and Jamaka faced each other not as brothers, but as enemies? As the night deepened, the steppe held its secrets close, waiting for the moment when one man's vision would rise above the other, or be lost in the dust of defeat. The steppe lay bathed in the soft glow of dawn, its grasses whispering secrets to the wind that swept across the endless plains. For Temujin, now a man whose name carried weight among the scattered tribes, the world was no longer a place of mere survival. It was a stage for destiny. The rift with his blood brother Jamaka had left a wound, but it had also sharpened his resolve. His small tribe, bound by loyalty and a shared vision, had grown into a force that could no longer be ignored. As the sun rose over the Anan River, casting golden light on the jurs of his followers, a moment approached that would transform Temujin from a leader into a legend. A moment when he would become Genghis Khan, the unifier of the Mongols. The years of hardship had forged Temujin into a man of iron will, his eyes burning with a fire that saw beyond the horizon. He was no longer the boy who had hidden from raiders or begged for aid from stronger men. His camp, once a handful of outcasts, now swelled with warriors, herders, and families who believed in his dream of a united steppe. Men like Gelmi and Subutai, whose loyalty had been earned through shared trials, stood by his side, their skills honed under his guidance. Bert, his wife, remained his anchor, her counsel a steady hand on the reins of his ambition. But to bind the Mongol tribes, fractious, proud, and scattered, required more than charisma or courage. It required a moment of undeniable power, a declaration that would echo across the plains. The steppe was a land of tradition, where leadership was not claimed but bestowed. The Mongols, divided into clans like the Borjigin, Taychiad, and Jadaran, had no single ruler. Each tribe followed its own chieftain, their loyalties shifting with the seasons or the promise of plunder. Temujin understood this, but he also saw the weakness in their disunity. The raids, the betrayals, the endless feuds, they were chains that bound the Mongols to a cycle of survival rather than greatness. He dreamed of a steppe where one banner flew above all, where strength was shared, not stolen. To make that dream real, he needed the tribes to see him not as a man, but as a force chosen by the eternal blue sky. The moment came in 1186, on the banks of the Anan, where the river's gentle flow mirrored the gathering tide of Temujin's ambition. He called a Kurultai, a great assembly of the Mongol tribes, summoning chieftains, warriors, and shamans from across the steppe. It was a bold move, for Temujin was not yet a Khan, and many saw him as an upstart, a boy who had risen too far too fast. Yet his victories, rescuing Bert, gathering outcasts, defying enemies, had earned him a reputation. Men came, drawn by curiosity, fear, or the faint hope of something greater. The Karaids, led by Togrul, sent riders. The Anjarat, bound by Bert's blood, pledged their support. Even some of the Teichiad, who had once abandoned him, arrived, their pride tempered by his growing power. The Kurultai was a spectacle of steppe tradition. Under a vast sky, the tribes gathered, their horses forming a sea of restless hooves, their banners fluttering like the wings of eagles. Temujin stood before them, his frame lean but commanding, his voice steady as he spoke of a future where the Mongols would no longer raid each other, but stand as one. He spoke of the eternal blue sky, Tengri, whose will had guided him through betrayal and loss. He spoke of loyalty, not to bloodlines, but to a shared purpose. His words were not those of a chieftain seeking power, but of a man who saw a destiny larger than himself, a destiny for all Mongols. The shamans, keepers of the spirits, played a pivotal role. They burned herbs, their smoke curling toward the heavens, and read the signs in the bones of sheep. One, an elder with eyes like polished stone, declared that Tengri had chosen Temujin, that the sky itself had marked him for greatness. The chieftains, moved by his words and the weight of the moment, began to chant a name, not Temujin, but Genghis, meaning universal ruler. It was a title that carried the weight of the sky, a name that would bind the tribes or break them. As the chant grew, echoing across the steppe, Temujin accepted the title, not with pride, but with a quiet resolve. He was no longer just a man. He was Genghis Khan, the leader destined to unite the Mongols. This moment was more than a coronation. It was a transformation. Genghis Khan reorganized his followers, breaking the old tribal hierarchies. He appointed loyal men like Jelmi and Subutai as commanders, not because of their birth, but their skill. He created a system of Arban, groups of 10 warriors who swore loyalty to one another and to him, forging a chain of trust that could not be broken by clan rivalries. He welcomed the lowborn alongside the noble, giving each a place in his vision. This was a radical departure from tradition, and it drew both admiration and resentment. To some, Genghis was a savior, to others, a threat to the old ways. But the steppe was not yet his. Jamaka, his former Anda, did not attend the Kurultai. From his own camp, he watched with a heart torn between pride and envy. The title of Genghis Khan was a challenge to his own ambitions, a spark that would ignite the rivalry between them. Togrul, too, grew uneasy, his alliance with Genghis strained by the younger man's rising star. The steppe, vast as it was too small for so many dreams of power. Genghis knew this, and he prepared his people for the trials ahead, training them not just to fight, but to think as one, to move like the wind, to strike like lightning. As he stood on a hill, looking over his newly unified tribes, Genghis felt the weight of his new name. Bert, ever his anchor, stood beside him, her eyes reflecting the fire of his vision. The steppe stretched before them, its beauty a reminder of what could be won and what could be lost. The making of Genghis Khan was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a greater one. The tribes were united, but not yet forged into a single blade. Enemies waited, Jamaka, Togrul, the Merkits, the Tatars, and the steppe whispered of battles to come, battles that would test the man who had dared to claim the sky's mandate. What would it mean to be Genghis Khan, to lead a people whose hearts were as wild as the steppe itself? As the wind carried the chants of his name across the plains, a shadow loomed. a shadow of war, of ambition, of a destiny that would reshape the world. The steppe stretched beneath a sky of endless blue, its grasses swaying in a rhythm as old as the earth itself. For Genghis Khan, newly declared the unifier of the Mongol tribes, the world was no longer a place of scattered dreams. It was a battlefield, vast and unforgiving, where only the cunning and the bold could prevail. The title of Genghis, meaning universal ruler, was a mantle of immense weight, but it was not enough to simply claim it. To hold the loyalty of the Mongols, to forge them into a force that could withstand the storms of rivalry and ambition, Genghis needed more than words. He needed to master the art of war on the steppe, to transform his people into a weapon unlike any the world had seen. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the plains, the hooves of his warriors began to beat a new rhythm, one that would echo far beyond the horizon. The steppe was a land made for war. Its open expanses offered no walls, no fortresses, only the speed of horses and the skill of those who rode them. The Mongols were born to this life, their childhoods spent in the saddle, their hands trained to the bow before they could walk. But Genghis saw beyond the chaos of tribal raids, the fleeting victories that faded with the next season. He envisioned a war machine, disciplined and relentless, where every man moved as part of a greater whole. The steppe, with its harsh winds and endless vistas, was both his canvas and his crucible, and he set about reshaping his people into a force that could bend it to his will. Genghis's genius lay not in brute strength, but in strategy. He understood the steppe's rhythms, the way the wind carried sound, the way rivers shaped the land, the way a single misstep could spell doom. He reorganized his warriors into units of 10, called Arban, each bound by an oath of loyalty to one another and to him. 10 Arbans formed a Jagan of 100, 10 Jagans a Mingan of 1,000, and 10 Mingans a Tumen of 10,000. This structure was not just a hierarchy, it was a web of trust, ensuring that every man knew his place and his purpose. Loyalty was the spine of his army, and Genghis rewarded it fiercely, promoting men like Gelmi and Subutai not for their blood, but for their skill and devotion. The Mongol warriors, under Genghis's command, became masters of mobility. Their horses, small but sturdy, could travel for days without rest, carrying riders who lived on dried meat and mare's milk. Genghis trained his men to strike and vanish, using the steppe's vastness as a weapon. They practiced the feigned retreat, luring enemies into traps where arrows rained like a storm. Their bows, crafted from wood, sinew, and bone, could pierce armor from hundreds of paces, loosed from horseback at full gallop. Genghis himself rode among them, his presence a spark that ignited their courage, his commands sharp and clear as the crack of a whip. But war was not just about fighting, it was about thinking. Genghis understood the power of fear, of surprise, of the unknown. He sent scouts to map the steppe, their eyes trained to spot the smallest signs of an enemy's movement. He used spies, disguised as traders or wanderers, to sow discord among rival tribes, planting whispers of weakness or betrayal. He studied his enemies, learning their strengths and exploiting their flaws. The Merkits, who had stolen Bert, relied on their numbers. Genghis outmaneuvered them with speed. The Tatars, proud and vengeful, were lured into ambushes where the steppe itself became their enemy. One of Genghis's first campaigns as Khan was against the Taychiad, the clan that had abandoned his family after his father's death. The memory of their betrayal burned in him, a fire that fueled his strategy. He struck their camps at dawn, his warriors moving like shadows, their arrows silent until the moment of impact. The Taychiad, caught off guard, scattered under the onslaught, their chieftain Targutai captured and brought before Genghis. In a moment that defined his leadership, Genghis spared Targutai's life, offering him a place in his tribe. It was a gesture of mercy, but also of power, a signal that Genghis could afford to forgive because his strength was undeniable. Many Taychiad warriors, seeing this, swore loyalty to him, swelling his ranks. This victory was a turning point, a proof that Genghis's vision could triumph over the old ways. His army grew, not just in numbers, but in skill. He trained his men to fight in all seasons, through blizzards and heat, their endurance a match for the steppe's cruelty. He developed signals, flags by day, torches by night, that allowed his forces to move as one, even across vast distances. He crafted a network of messengers, the Yam, who could carry orders faster than any enemy could react. Every detail, from the repair of arrows to the care of horses, was part of his plan, a tapestry of war woven with precision. Yet Genghis's art of war was not without cost. The steppe was a land of blood, and every victory left bodies in its wake. Bert, ever his confidant, watched him with eyes that saw both the man and the Khan. "You build a nation," she said one night, her voice soft as the river's flow, "but take care that it does not consume you." Her words lingered, a reminder that power, like the steppe, could be both ally and enemy. Genghis listened, but his heart was set on a greater prize. Not just the steppe, but the world beyond. As his reputation grew, so did his enemies. Jamaka, his former Anda, was gathering his own forces, his charisma drawing tribes to his banner. Togrul, the Karayid Khan, wavered in his alliance, his loyalty strained by Genghis's rising star. The Merkits and Tatars, though weakened, still nursed their grudges, their knives sharp in the shadows. The steppe, for all its vastness, was growing smaller, its tribes forced to choose sides in a conflict that would reshape their world. Genghis, standing atop a hill, his banner fluttering in the wind, knew that the art of war was only the beginning. The true test lay ahead, in battles that would demand not just skill, but sacrifice. What would happen when Genghis's new army faced its first true challenge, a foe that could match his cunning and his fire? As the steppe whispered of wars to come, the hooves of his warriors beat a rhythm that promised glory or ruin. The steppe, with its endless sweep of grass and sky, had been Genghis Khan's crucible, shaping him from a fugitive boy into a unifier of tribes. But as the sun rose over the jurs of his growing nation, his eyes turned beyond the familiar plains to the lands where stone cities rose and rivers ran through deserts. The year was 1205, and Genghis, now in his 40s, stood as the undisputed leader of the Mongols, his banner a symbol of a new era. Yet the steppe alone could not contain his ambition. To forge an empire, he needed to test his people against a foe unlike any they had faced, a kingdom of walls and wealth, the Zaizia. As the wind carried the scent of distant sands, Genghis prepared to lead his warriors into a conquest that would mark the first step toward a world reshaped by his will. The Zaizia, or Tangut Empire, lay to the south, in the shadow of the Gobi Desert. It was a land of irrigated fields and fortified cities, its people farmers and traders who bowed to a king, not a Khan. Unlike the nomadic tribes of the steppe, the Zaizia had walls of stone, armies trained to hold lines, and a treasury filled with silk and silver. To the Mongols, accustomed to the open plains, this was an alien world, both a challenge and a prize. Genghis saw in the Zaizia not just wealth, but a test, a chance to prove that his united tribes could conquer more than grass and sky, that they could break the barriers of a settled kingdom. Genghis's preparation was meticulous, a reflection of the mind that had transformed the Mongols into a disciplined force. He sent scouts across the Gobi, their eyes mapping the paths through the desert's dunes, noting the Zaizia's defenses and the flow of their rivers. He consulted with Bert, whose wisdom tempered his ambition, and with his trusted commanders, Gelmi and Subutai, whose minds were as sharp as their swords. The Mongols were horsemen, their strength in speed and surprise, but the Zaizia's cities demanded a new kind of war. Genghis trained his warriors to adapt, teaching them to besiege walls, to use captured prisoners as shields, to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The campaign began with the thunder of hooves, as Genghis led his army, tens of thousands strong, across the Gobi. The desert was a harsh mistress, its sands swallowing the careless, its heat a test of endurance. But the Mongols, hardened by the steppe's winters, rode with a purpose that burned brighter than the sun. Genghis's strategy was simple but devastating. Strike fast, strike hard, and never let the enemy find their footing. His warriors moved like a storm, their horses a blur against the horizon, their arrows a rain that fell before the Zaizia could raise their banners. The first target was the city of Yinchuan, the Zaizia's capital, a fortress of stone and pride. The Tanguts, confident behind their walls, expected to outlast the nomads, whom they saw as little more than barbarians. But Genghis was no ordinary raider. He used the Yellow River, which fed the city's fields, as a weapon, diverting its waters to flood the surrounding lands. The tactic was not wholly successful. The flood damaged his own camp as well, but it sowed chaos, weakening the Zaizia's resolve. His warriors, trained to strike and vanish, harried the enemy's supply lines, cutting off food and reinforcements. The Zaizia, unused to such relentless pressure, began to falter. Genghis's genius lay not just in destruction, but in adaptation. When the walls of Yinchuan held, he turned to diplomacy, sending emissaries to demand tribute. The Zaizia king, wary of his dwindling resources, agreed to pay silver, silk, and cattle, and offered his daughter as a bride to seal the peace. Genghis, ever pragmatic, accepted, knowing that tribute strengthened his army and a marriage tied the Zaizia to his will. The campaign, though not a total conquest, was a triumph, a proof that the Mongols could challenge a settled kingdom and win. The wealth of the Zaizia filled Genghis's coffers, and the knowledge gained from their cities sharpened his strategies for the wars to come. The conquest of the Zaizia was a turning point, not just for Genghis, but for the Mongols as a people. They returned to the steppe with more than gold. They brought stories of cities that could be broken, of kings who could be humbled. Genghis's warriors, once raiders of herds, now dreamed of empires. He rewarded them generously, sharing the spoils with even the lowliest rider, reinforcing the loyalty that bound his army. Bert, watching the growing wealth of their camp, cautioned him, "Gold can buy swords, but only hearts win wars." Her words, spoken in the quiet of their jur, reminded Genghis that his true strength lay in the men who followed him, not the treasures they carried. But the victory also drew new eyes. The Jin dynasty to the east, a vast empire of walled cities and ancient power, took note of the Mongol Khan who had humbled their neighbor. Jamaka, still a rival on the steppe, grew bolder, his own forces swelling as he sought to challenge Genghis's title. Togrul, the Karayid Khan, wavered further, his alliance fraying under the weight of envy. The steppe, once a world of scattered tribes, was now a stage where great powers collided, and Genghis stood at its center, his ambition a beacon and a threat. As he rode back to the Anan River, his banner high, Genghis looked to the south, where mountains hid the lands of greater empires. The Zaizia had been a test, a first step beyond the steppe. The wealth and knowledge gained were tools, but the true prize was the confidence of his people, their belief that they could conquer not just tribes, but nations. Yet the path ahead was fraught with danger. The Jin, with their armies and cities, loomed like a storm on the horizon, and the steppe itself was not yet fully his. The fire of conquest burned in Genghis's heart, but it was a fire that could consume him if he faltered. What would happen when Genghis turned his eyes to the Jin, a foe far greater than the Zaizia? As the steppe whispered of battles yet to come, the hooves of his warriors carried a promise of glory, or of a war that could break the man who dared to dream of empires. The steppe lay quiet under a sky streaked with the soft pinks of dawn, its vastness a canvas for dreams that stretched beyond the horizon. For Genghis Khan, now a seasoned leader in his 40s, the conquest of the Zaizia had been a spark, igniting the ambitions of his united Mongol tribes. The wealth of silver and silk, the knowledge of besieging cities, and the confidence of his warriors had transformed his vision from a dream of the steppe into a hunger for empires. His eyes now turned eastward, to the Jin dynasty, a colossus of stone walls and ancient power that ruled over northern China. As the wind carried the scent of distant lands, Genghis prepared to lead his people into a clash that would test the limits of their strength and reshape the world. The Jin dynasty was no mere kingdom like the Zaizia. It was a vast empire, its cities fortified with towering walls, its armies clad in iron, its coffers brimming with the wealth of 1,000 years. The Jin ruled over a land of rice fields and bustling markets, their emperor seated in the great city of Zhangdu, a place of such splendor that it seemed to mock the simplicity of the steppe. To the Mongols, accustomed to the freedom of open plains, the Jin were both a mystery and a challenge, a foe whose strength lay not in speed, but in numbers and stone. Yet Genghis saw opportunity where others saw only danger. The Jin had long meddled in steppe politics, pitting tribes like the Tatars against the Mongols to keep them divided. This interference, and the old grudge of his father's death at Tatar hands, fueled Genghis's resolve. The campaign began in 1211, a year when the steppe grasses stood tall and the omens of the shamans spoke of great deeds. Genghis gathered his tumens, tens of thousands of warriors whose horses could outrun the wind. His commanders, Jelmi, Subutai, and his brother Kassar, were now seasoned leaders, their loyalty as unyielding as the steppe's winter. Bert, ever his confidant, offered counsel that tempered his ambition with caution. A wall may stand tall, but it cannot move. Use their strength against them. Her words echoed in his mind as he led his army across the Gobi, their hooves a thunder that announced their coming to the world beyond. The Jin were not unprepared. Their spies had whispered of the Mongol Khan, a barbarian who had united the tribes and humbled the Zaizia. They fortified their northern passes, stationing armies in the narrow valleys that led to their heartland. But Genghis was a master of the unexpected. He avoided the heavily guarded passes, leading his warriors through treacherous mountain trails that the Jin deemed impassable. His scouts, moving like ghosts, mapped the terrain, while his spies sowed fear among the Jin's allies, whispering of a horde that could not be stopped. When the Mongols emerged from the mountains, they struck like lightning, their arrows darkening the sky before the Jin could muster their defenses. The first battles were brutal, a clash of worlds. The Jin fought in disciplined ranks, their spears and crossbows a wall of steel. The Mongols, however, were a storm, fluid, relentless, unstoppable. Genghis used the feigned retreat, a tactic perfected on the steppe, to lure Jin armies into open ground where his cavalry could encircle them. His warriors, riding in tight formations, loosed arrows with deadly precision, cutting down enemies from a distance before closing in with sabers. Subutai, with his keen mind, devised ambushes that turned valleys into death traps, while Jelmi led charges that broke the Jin's morale. The Mongols' speed and adaptability were unlike anything the Jin had faced, and their victories piled like stones, each one a step closer to Zhengdu. Yet the Jin were not easily broken. Their cities, with walls that rose like mountains, defied the Mongols' arrows. Genghis, learning from the Zaizia campaign, adapted. He used captured Chinese engineers to build siege weapons, catapults, battering rams, and ladders that could challenge stone. He employed psychological warfare, spreading tales of Mongol invincibility, offering mercy to those who surrendered and death to those who resisted. Villages and towns fell, their gates opened by fear as much as force. The Jin emperor, desperate to stem the tide, sent emissaries with offers of gold and tribute, but Genghis, sensing weakness, pressed on, his eyes fixed on the prize of Zhengdu itself. The campaign was not without cost. The Mongols, though masters of the steppe, suffered in the alien terrain of northern China. Disease crept into their camps, and the long marches strained even their hardy horses. Genghis, riding among his men, shared their hardships, eating the same dried meat, sleeping under the same stars. His presence was a fire that kept their spirits burning, but he knew the toll of war. Bert's letters, carried by swift messengers, reminded him of home, of the steppe that waited for their return. "You conquer lands," she wrote, "but do not lose the hearts of those who follow you." Her words were a tether, grounding him as the campaign stretched into years. By 1214, the Mongols had carved a path of destruction through the Jin's northern territories, their victories a testament to Genghis's genius. The Jin, battered but not broken, offered a truce, tribute, a princess, and promises of peace. Genghis, wary but pragmatic, accepted, knowing that his army needed rest and his people needed the spoils. The Jin's tribute filled his coffers with gold, horses, and silk, strengthening his hold on the steppe. But the truce was fragile, a pause in a war that was far from over. The Jin emperor, fearing Zhengdu's fall, moved his court south, a sign of weakness that Genghis noted with a predator's instinct. As the Mongols returned to the steppe, their jurs heavy with the wealth of conquest, Genghis stood on a hill, looking east. The Jin had been wounded, but not defeated, and their cities still stood, a challenge to his ambition. The steppe, his home, was now a springboard to greater dreams, dreams of an empire that stretched beyond the mountains. But the path was not clear. Old enemies like Jamaka still stirred on the steppe, and new ones like the Jin waited in their fortresses. The clash had been a triumph, but it was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite a fire to consume the world, or burn out in the attempt. What would happen when Genghis returned to face the Jin? Their walls stronger, their resolve hardened by fear. As the steppe whispered of greater wars, the hooves of his warriors carried a promise of empire, or of a battle that could break the Khan who dared to challenge the heavens. The steppe, with its boundless skies and whispering grasses, seemed a world away from the stone walls of Zhengdu, the glittering capital of the Jin dynasty. For Genghis Khan, now a seasoned conqueror whose name sent tremors through the courts of empires, the campaign against the Jin had been a proving ground, a clash that showed the Mongols could humble a kingdom of wealth and power. Yet the heart of the Jin remained unbroken, its capital a fortress of defiance that stood as a challenge to his ambition. As the year 1214 faded into 1215, Genghis turned his eyes once more to Zhengdu, modern-day Beijing, determined to bring its towers to their knees. Under a sky heavy with the promise of storm, the hooves of his warriors thundered, carrying the weight of a destiny that would reshape the world. Zhengdu was no mere city. It was a monument to the Jin's might, its walls rising like mountains, its gates guarded by armies clad in iron. The city sprawled across the plain, its palaces and markets a testament to centuries of wealth, its people accustomed to the protection of stone and steel. To the Mongols, whose lives were bound to the open steppe, Zhengdu was both a marvel and a mystery, a prize that could elevate their Khan to legend or break his army against its unyielding defenses. Genghis, with his sharp mind and sharper resolve, saw not just a city, but a symbol. To take Zhengdu was to prove that no wall could stand against the will of the Mongols. The campaign began with a return to the strategies that had brought Genghis victory. He gathered his Tumens, now hardened by years of war, their loyalty a fire that burned brighter than the Jin's torches. Subutai, his greatest general, scouted the approaches to Zhengdu, mapping its weaknesses with a fox's cunning. Gelmi, ever loyal, trained the warriors to wield new siege weapons, catapults and rams crafted by captured Chinese engineers. Genghis himself rode among his men, his presence a spark that ignited their courage. Bert, though far away on the steppe, sent words of wisdom through swift messengers. A city is not its walls, but its people. Break their spirit, and the gates will open. Her counsel, as always, was a guiding star. The Mongols swept toward Zhengdu like a tide, their horses a blur against the horizon. The Jin, warned of their coming, had fortified the city, their armies bolstered by reinforcements from the south. But Genghis did not strike directly. He knew the strength of Zhengdu's walls and the cost of a frontal assault. Instead, he unleashed a campaign of terror on the surrounding lands, burning villages, seizing granaries, and cutting off the city's lifelines. His warriors, moving with the speed of the steppe wind, struck and vanished, leaving the Jin's armies chasing shadows. The countryside, once lush with fields, became a wasteland, its people fleeing or surrendering to the Mongols' mercy. The siege of Zhengdu was a test of endurance, a battle of wills as much as weapons. Genghis encircled the city, his camps a ring of fire and steel, his catapults hurling stones that shook the walls. He used psychological warfare, sending captured Jin soldiers to the gates with tales of Mongol invincibility, urging surrender to spare lives. Inside Zhengdu, hunger began to gnaw. The Jin emperor, now desperate, had moved his court south to Kaifeng, leaving the city in the hands of generals who wavered under the pressure. The people, trapped within, felt the weight of starvation, their hope fading with each passing day. Genghis, ever patient, waited, knowing that time was his ally. In the spring of 1215, after months of siege, Zhengdu's defenses began to crack. The Jin's armies, weakened by hunger and disease, could no longer hold the walls. Genghis, sensing the moment, unleashed his full might. His warriors scaled the ramparts under cover of darkness, their arrows a storm that silenced the defenders' crossbows. The gates fell, and the Mongols poured into the city like a river breaking its banks. Zhengdu, the jewel of the Jin, was theirs. The palaces with their gilded roofs were looted, The treasuries, filled with silk and gold, were emptied. Yet Genghis showed restraint, sparing those who surrendered and offering mercy to the city's scholars and artisans, whose skills he valued for his growing empire. The fall of Zhengdu was a triumph that echoed across the world. The Mongols, once dismissed as barbarians, had brought a mighty empire to its knees. The wealth of the city, gold, horses, and knowledge, flowed back to the steppe, strengthening Genghis's hold on his people. He appointed trusted men to govern the captured territories, blending Mongol loyalty with Chinese administration. But the victory was not without shadows. The cost of the campaign had been high, with lives lost to disease and battle. Bert's letters, carried across the mountains, reminded him of the steppe's simplicity, of the home that waited for their return. "You have taken a city," she wrote, "but do not let it take your soul." The fall of Zhengdu sent ripples far beyond the Jin. The Zaizia, once tributaries, grew restless, their king wary of Mongol power. Jamukha, still a rival on the steppe, saw Genghis's success as a challenge to his own ambitions. And in the distant west, whispers of the Mongol Khan reached the ears of empires yet untouched. Genghis, standing amidst the ruins of Zhengdu's gates, looked to the horizon, his mind already turning to new conquests. The Jin were wounded, but not defeated, their southern lands still defiant. The steppe, his heartland, was secure, but the world beyond called, a world of cities, kings, and challenges that would test the limits of his vision. As he rode back to the steppe, his banner high, Genghis carried the weight of Zhengdu's fall. It was a victory that marked him as more than a Khan. It marked him as a force that could reshape empires. But the path ahead was fraught with danger. The Jin's southern strongholds loomed, and new enemies stirred in the west, their names unknown but their power undeniable. The steppe whispered of greater wars, of a destiny that could crown Genghis as the master of the world, or cast him into the dust of those he had conquered. What would happen when Genghis turned his gaze westward, to lands where the steppe gave way to deserts and mountains? As the stars burned above, their light cold and unyielding, the hooves of his warriors carried a promise of empire, or of a war that could break the Khan who dared to challenge the heavens. The steppe lay bathed in the golden glow of a setting sun, its endless grasses whispering tales of conquest and ambition. For Genghis Khan, now a titan whose name reverberated from the plains of Mongolia to the fallen walls of Zhengdu, the world was no longer bound by the horizons of his youth. The conquest of the Jin dynasty's capital had proven that the Mongols could break the mightiest of cities, but Genghis's vision stretched further, to the distant lands of the west, where empires of silk and spice awaited. In 1218, his gaze fell upon the Khwarezmian Empire, a realm of glittering cities and vast wealth that sprawled across Central Asia. As the stars emerged, casting their cold light over the steppe, a catastrophic chain of events began, a clash born of pride and betrayal that would unleash a storm unlike any the world had seen. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, was a power to rival the Jin. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Gurganj, were jewels of trade, their markets filled with silk from China, spices from India, and gold from the west. The Khwarezmians, a people of Persian and Turkic blood, boasted armies of cavalry and infantry, their strength rooted in the wealth of the Silk Road. To Genghis, this was not just a land of riches, but a gateway to the world beyond the steppe, a chance to extend his empire to the edges of the known world. He sought not war, but trade, hoping to bind the Khwarezmians to his growing network of tribute and alliance. Genghis's first move was one of diplomacy, a gesture that belied the warrior within. He sent a caravan of 500 merchants, laden with furs, silver, and promises of friendship, to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar. The caravan carried a message from the Khan, an offer of trade, a chance to share the wealth of the steppe and the Silk Road. Genghis, ever pragmatic, saw the value of peace with a power as great as his own. But the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, saw not an opportunity but a threat. Suspicious of Mongol intentions, or perhaps greedy for the caravan's riches, he seized the merchants, accused them of spying, and with the Shah's approval, executed them. Only one man escaped, carrying the tale of betrayal back to Genghis. The news struck like a thunderbolt. Genghis, sitting in his jur on the steppe, felt the sting of dishonor. The murder of his envoys was not just an act of war. It was an insult to the eternal blue sky, a challenge to his authority as Khan. Bert, his ever-wise confidant, saw the fire in his eyes and cautioned restraint. Vengeance is a blade that cuts both ways. But Genghis's heart burned with a fury tempered by calculation. He sent a second embassy to Shah Mohammed, demanding justice, the surrender of Inalchuq and reparations for the slain. The Shah, blinded by pride, refused, and in a final act of defiance, executed the Mongol ambassadors, shaving their heads and sending them back as a grisly message. This was the spark that ignited the catastrophe. Genghis, now in his 50s, summoned his Tumens, his army now a honed blade of 100,000 warriors. Subutai, Jelmi, and his sons, Jachai, Chagatai, and Urjadai, stood ready, their loyalty as unyielding as the steppe's winter. The Mongols crossed the Tian Shan mountains, their horses enduring paths that seemed carved for goats, not men. Genghis's strategy was not one of reckless rage, but of devastating precision. He divided his forces, sending Subutai to strike the Khwarezmian flanks while he led the main army toward Otrar, the city where his honor had been stained. The siege of Otrar was a storm of retribution. The Mongols, masters of siegecraft learned from the Jin, surrounded the city with a ring of steel and fire. Catapults hurled stones, flaming arrows lit the night, and the defenders' resolve crumbled under the weight of Mongol ferocity. When Otrar fell, Genghis spared no one. Inalchuq was executed, molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment that echoed the steppe's unforgiving justice. The city was razed, its wealth carried back to the Mongol camps, its people either enslaved or scattered. The fall of Otrar was a warning to the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis Khan's vengeance was a force no wall could withstand. From Otrar, the Mongols swept westward, their campaign a whirlwind that consumed city after city. Bukhara fell next, its mosques and markets looted, its scholars spared only to serve Genghis's growing empire. Samarkand, the Khwarezmian jewel, held out longer, its walls manned by thousands. But Genghis, using prisoners as human shields and his cavalry as a relentless tide, broke its defenses. Shah Mohammed, overwhelmed by the Mongol onslaught, fled, his empire fracturing under the weight of his failure. Genghis pursued, his warriors hunting the Shah across deserts and mountains until he died, broken and alone, on an island in the Caspian Sea. The conquest was a triumph, but it was also a catastrophe. The Khwarezmian cities, once vibrant hubs of trade, were reduced to ash and ruin. Rivers of blood flowed, and entire populations were displaced or enslaved. Genghis, though victorious, saw the cost of his vengeance. The steppe, his home, was far away, and the weight of empire grew heavier. Bert's letters, carried by the swift messengers of the Yam, spoke of the steppe's simplicity, of the children who awaited their father's return. "You have broken their cities," she wrote, "but do not let their ruin break you." The fall of the Khwarezmian Empire sent shockwaves across the world. The steppe was no longer a distant land of nomads. It was the heart of an empire that could shatter kingdoms. But the campaign had stretched the Mongols thin, and new challenges loomed. The Jin, still defiant in their southern strongholds, watched from afar, while whispers of new powers in the west, lands of knights and caliphs, reached Genghis's ears. As he stood amidst the ruins of Samarkand, his banner high, Genghis knew that the world was vast and his work was far from done. The catastrophe had been his, but so too was the glory and the burden of what was to come. What would happen as Genghis pushed further west, into lands where the steppe gave way to new worlds? As the wind carried the ashes of fallen cities, the hooves of his warriors whispered of conquests yet to come, and of a Khan whose ambition could either crown him or consume him. The steppe, with its endless sweep of grass and sky, had become the heartbeat of an empire, its rhythm set by the hooves of Genghis Khan's warriors. The Khwarezmian catastrophe had left cities in ruins and the world trembling at the name of the Mongol Khan, now a figure whose shadow stretched from the Gobi to the Caspian Sea. In 1220, as the dust of Samarkand settled and the wealth of Central Asia filled his coffers, Genghis turned his gaze further west, to lands where the steppe gave way to mountains, deserts, and rivers unknown to his people. The tide of conquest, unstoppable as a spring flood, carried him toward new horizons, where empires and kingdoms awaited the test of his will. As the stars burned above, their light cold and unyielding, the Mongols rode into a world that would never be the same. The lands west of the Khwarezmian Empire were a mosaic of powers, each with its own pride and strength. Beyond the Oxus River lay the realms of Persia, the Caucasus, and the distant fringes of Eastern Europe, lands of stone fortresses, knightly orders, and ancient dynasties. These were places where the Silk Road wove its threads, where traders carried tales of the Mongol storm that had shattered Bukhara and Samarkand. Genghis, now in his late 50s, was no longer driven by vengeance alone. His ambition had grown into a vision of an empire that spanned the world, united under the eternal blue sky. To achieve this, he needed to conquer not just armies, but the very idea of resistance. The campaign westward was a masterpiece of strategy, a testament to Genghis's genius. He divided his forces, sending his sons, Jachai, Chagatai, and Urjadai to secure the northern routes, while his trusted generals, Subutai and Jibi, led a daring expedition through the Caucasus. Genghis himself took the main army south, toward the remnants of the Khwarezmian Empire and the lands of Persia. His warriors, hardened by years of war, moved with a precision that belied their numbers. Their horses, fed on the steppe's tough grasses, carried them across deserts where others faltered. Their bows, loosed from horseback, struck with a speed that no armored knight could match. The Mongols were not just an army. They were a force of nature, reshaping the world with every step. The first to fall were the cities of southern Persia, where the Khwarezmian prince Jalal al-Din, son of the fallen Shah, rallied a desperate resistance. Jalal was a warrior of courage, his defiance a spark in the ashes of his empire. He gathered an army of survivors, striking at Mongol outposts with a ferocity that caught even Genghis's attention. But the Khan was unrelenting. At the Battle of the Indus River in 1221, Genghis outmaneuvered Jalal, using a feigned retreat to lure his forces into a trap. The Mongol cavalry, sweeping down like a hawk, crushed the Khwarezmian army, and Jalal fled, leaping into the river to escape. Genghis, watching from the bank, spared a nod of respect for the prince's courage, but his empire would know no mercy. The cities that harbored Jalal's men were razed, their wealth and people absorbed into the Mongol machine. Meanwhile, Subutai and Jibi carved a path through the Caucasus, their campaign a legend in itself. They defeated the Georgians, whose knights were no match for Mongol speed, and outwitted the Kipchak Turks, whose nomadic ways mirrored their own. In a daring sweep, they rode north to the Russian steppes, clashing with the princes of Kiev at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. The Russian armies, divided and unprepared, fell before the Mongol storm, their defeat a warning to the west. Subutai and Jibi, ever loyal, sent word to Genghis of lands ripe for conquest, of kingdoms that knew nothing of the Khan's power. Their expedition, a reconnaissance in force, was a glimpse of the tide that would one day sweep across Europe. The conquests were not without cost. The Mongols, stretched across thousands of miles, faced challenges their steppe-borne tactics could not easily overcome. The mountains of the Caucasus slowed their horses, and the deserts of Persia tested their endurance. Disease crept into their camps, and the constant march strained even their iron will. Genghis, riding at the head of his army, shared their hardships, his presence a fire that kept them moving. Bert's letters, carried by the swift riders of the Yam, reached him even in the farthest reaches of his conquests. "You ride to the ends of the earth," she wrote, "but the steppe calls you home." Her words were a reminder of the life he had left behind, of the family that anchored his ambition. The tide of conquest brought wealth beyond imagining. Gold, silk, and slaves poured into the Mongol camps, transforming the steppe into a hub of trade and power. Genghis, ever pragmatic, spared artisans and scholars, sending them to Karakorum, his burgeoning capital, to build a city worthy of his empire. He adopted the scripts and systems of the conquered, blending them with Mongol traditions to govern his vast domains. But the westward push also brought new enemies. The Abbasid Caliphate, the Volga Bulgars, and the distant kingdoms of Europe began to stir, their rulers whispering of the barbarian Khan whose armies seemed unstoppable. As Genghis stood on the banks of the Oxus, his banner fluttering in the desert wind, he felt the weight of his empire. The steppe, his heartland, was far away, and the lands he had conquered were as fractious as they were rich. His sons, now generals in their own right, bore the strain of their father's expectations, their rivalries a shadow over the future. The Jin, though weakened, still held their southern strongholds, and the Zaizia, once tributaries, showed signs of rebellion. Genghis knew that his empire, vast as it was, rested on his ability to keep it united, a task that would demand every ounce of his cunning. The westward conquests had made Genghis a legend, but they had also stretched his empire to its limits. As he looked to the horizon, where mountains hid lands yet unconquered, he wondered what lay beyond. The steppe had given him strength, but the world was vast, and its challenges were endless. The tide of conquest had carried him far, but it was a tide that could turn, sweeping away all he had built if he faltered. As the wind whispered of battles yet to come, Genghis's heart beat with the rhythm of a man who had conquered empires. But who knew that the greatest battles were still ahead? What would happen as Genghis faced the challenge of holding his empire together, of balancing conquest with the needs of his people? As the stars wheeled above, their light a silent witness, the steppe waited for the Khan to write the next chapter of his legend, or to fall beneath the weight of his own ambition. The steppe stretched beneath a sky of fading light, its grasses swaying like a sea that carried the dreams of a man who had conquered nations. For Genghis Khan, now in his late 50s, the tide of conquest had swept him from the plains of Mongolia to the ruins of Samarkand, his empire a vast tapestry woven from the threads of war and ambition. Yet as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the jurs of his people, Genghis faced a challenge greater than any city or army. The bonds of his family, the sons and daughters who would carry his legacy, or tear it apart. As the wind whispered through the steppe, it bore the weight of a Khan's heart, torn between the empire he had built and the family that anchored it. Genghis's family was both his strength and his burden. Bert, his first and most trusted wife, remained the steady flame at the center of his world. Her wisdom had guided him through betrayal, her strength had sustained him through loss, and her love had given him purpose beyond conquest. Together they had 4 sons, Jachai, Chagatai, Urjadai, and Talyui, each a pillar of the empire, but also a spark of rivalry that threatened to ignite. There were daughters, too, like Chechyaijin and Alakai, whose marriages to allied chieftains wove a web of loyalty across the steppe. But it was the sons, heirs to the Khan's name, who carried the weight of his legacy, and their tensions were a storm brewing beneath the surface. Jachai, the eldest, was a warrior of unmatched courage, his skill in battle rivaled only by Subutai. Yet his birth was shadowed by doubt. Captured by the Merkits during Bert's abduction, Jachai's paternity was questioned by his brothers, who whispered that he might be the son of a Merkit captor. Genghis, though he treated Jachai as his own, could not silence the rumors, and the rift between Jachai and his brothers grew. Chagatai, the second son, was fiery and proud, his temper a mirror of his father's youth. He clashed with Jachai, challenging his place in the line of succession, his words sharp as a saber. Urjadai, the third, was calmer, his mind sharp with diplomacy, but he lacked the martial fire of his brothers. Talyui, the youngest, was loyal and fierce, content to serve rather than rule, but his devotion made him a favorite of Genghis. The family's dynamics were a microcosm of the empire itself, bound by loyalty, but strained by ambition. Genghis, who had united the Mongols through shared purpose, knew that his sons could either strengthen his empire or fracture it. He sought to bind them through responsibility, giving each a role in his conquests. Jachai led campaigns in the northern steppes, securing the Kipchak tribes. Chagatai governed the conquered cities of Central Asia, his iron hand maintaining order. Urjadai, with his gift for negotiation, was sent to forge alliances, while Talyui rode at his father's side, a steadfast shadow. Yet the brothers' rivalries simmered, their arguments echoing in the jurs of Karakoram, the burgeoning capital of the Mongol Empire. Bert, ever the voice of reason, counseled Genghis in the quiet of their jur. An empire is only as strong as the hearts that hold it, she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Teach your sons to love each other, or they will tear down what you have built. Genghis listened, but the steppe had taught him that love alone could not bind men. He devised a system to balance his sons, appointing them governors of vast territories, but keeping ultimate power in his hands. He also looked to his daughters, whose marriages to leaders like the Angjarat and Uyghur chieftains strengthened the empire's edges. Alakai, in particular, proved a skilled ruler, governing with a wisdom that echoed her mother's. The question of succession loomed like a storm cloud. Genghis, though still vigorous, knew that his time was finite. The steppe's harsh life and the toll of endless campaigns weighed on him, his body marked by scars and his hair streaked with gray. Jachai, as the eldest, was the natural heir, but his disputed birth made him a divisive choice. Chagatai's pride made him ambitious but unyielding, while Talyui's loyalty was unquestioned but lacked the spark of leadership. Urgide, with his calm demeanor and diplomatic skill, began to emerge as a compromise, a man who could hold the empire together without fueling the flames of rivalry. Genghis, in a rare moment of reflection, consulted the shamans, seeking the will of the eternal blue sky. Their bones and omens pointed to Urgide, a choice that Genghis would later formalize, though not without pain. The family was not just a matter of succession, it was the heart of the empire's stability. Genghis's conquests had stretched his forces across continents, from the Jin's southern strongholds to the distant Caucasus. His sons and generals governed lands that spoke different tongues, worshipped different gods, and dreamed different dreams. To hold them together, Genghis relied on the loyalty of his family, but also on the systems he had built. The Yam messengers, the Yasa laws, the Arban units that bound his warriors. Yet he knew that no system could outlast a divided family. The steppe, with its endless cycle of feuds, had shown him the cost of disunity. As he stood on the hills above Karakoram, watching the city grow from tents to stone, Genghis felt the weight of his legacy. Bert, at his side, spoke of their children, of the grandchildren who played in the shadow of the empire. "They are your strength," she said, "but also your weakness." Her words lingered, a reminder that conquest was fleeting, but family was eternal. The empire, vast as it was, rested on the fragile bonds of those closest to him. The Jin still resisted in the south, the Zaizia stirred in rebellion, and the west whispered of new powers, caliphs and kings who would not bow easily. Genghis knew that his family must stand united, or all he had built would crumble. The steppe, with its timeless beauty, seemed to hold its breath. The stars above, witnesses to Genghis's rise, now watched as he navigated the delicate balance of family and empire. The sons who rode at his side, the daughters who ruled in his name, were the threads that held his vision together. But threads could fray, and the storm of succession loomed closer. As the wind carried the laughter of his grandchildren across the plains, Genghis wondered if his empire could endure the weight of his dreams, or if it would fall to the rivalries of those he loved most. What would happen as Genghis faced the challenge of rebellion in the lands he had conquered, and the growing tensions within his family? As the steppe whispered of trials yet to come, the Khan stood at the crossroads of empire and legacy, his heart a battlefield where love and ambition collided. The steppe lay hushed beneath a canopy of stars, each one a silent witness to the empire that Genghis Khan had carved from the windswept plains. In the early 1220s, as his conquests stretched from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the walls of northern China, Genghis stood at the zenith of his power, his name a thunder that echoed across continents. Yet for all his victories, he knew that an empire built on blood and hooves alone could not endure. To bind his vast domains, peoples of different tongues, faiths, and dreams, he needed more than swords, he needed law. The Yasa, his code of rules, became the backbone of his empire, a set of decrees as unyielding as the steppe itself. As the firelight flickered in his jur, Genghis wove a tapestry of order, one that would hold his empire together or fray under the weight of its own ambition. The Yasa was not born of whimsy, but of necessity. The Mongol tribes, once scattered and fractious, had been united under Genghis's banner, but their loyalty was as fragile as the grasses that bent in the wind. Beyond the steppe, his empire now encompassed cities of stone, markets of silk, and peoples who worshipped gods unknown to the eternal blue sky. The Jin, the Xia, the Khwarezmians, all had their own laws, their own traditions, and their own resentments. To govern them, Genghis needed a code that transcended tribe and faith, a law that could forge a single nation from the chaos of conquest. The Yasa was his answer, a set of decrees that blended the steppe's harsh justice with the pragmatism of a conqueror. The origins of the Yasa were rooted in the steppe's traditions, but shaped by Genghis's vision. He gathered his most trusted advisors, his brother Qasar, his general Subutai, and his adopted son Shigi Quituk, a scholar among warriors, to codify the rules that had guided his rise. The Yasa was not written in the ornate scripts of Chinese scribes or Persian poets. It was an oral code, memorized by the Mongols and enforced with iron resolve. Its simplicity was its strength, its clarity a reflection of the steppe's unyielding nature. Every man, from the lowliest herder to the mightiest general, was subject to its decrees, and Genghis himself bowed to its authority, proving that no one was above the law. The Yasa covered every facet of life in the empire. It forbade theft and adultery, crimes that could fracture the loyalty of a tribe. It demanded absolute obedience to the Khan, with death as the penalty for betrayal. It protected the Yam, the network of messengers who carried Genghis's orders across thousands of miles, ensuring the empire's veins remained open. It regulated trade, setting fair measures for goods and punishing those who cheated in the markets of conquered cities. It even addressed the sacred, declaring that all faiths, shamanism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, were to be respected, a decree that brought uneasy peace to the empire's diverse peoples. To the Mongols, who revered the eternal blue sky, this was a radical step, but Genghis saw unity in tolerance, knowing that division could unravel his empire. The Yasa's justice was swift and unforgiving, a mirror of the steppe's harsh realities. A thief caught stealing a horse faced death, for a horse was a man's life on the plains. A warrior who fled in battle was executed, his cowardice a stain on the Arban unit that bound him to his brothers. Yet the Yasa also rewarded loyalty and merit. A man of low birth could rise to command a tumen of 10,000 if he proved his worth, a principle that drew the ambitious and the brave to Genghis's banner. The code outlawed the enslavement of Mongols, ensuring that his people remained free, while captives from conquered lands were used to build the empire's cities and armies. Enforcing the Yasa across such a vast empire was a challenge that tested Genghis's ingenuity. He appointed judges, often drawn from his most loyal followers, to settle disputes in the camps and cities. Shigi Quituk, with his scholar's mind, became the chief arbiter, his rulings a bridge between the steppe's traditions and the needs of a growing empire. The Yam messengers carried the Yasa's decrees to the farthest reaches, ensuring that even in distant Persia or China, the Khan's law held sway. Genghis himself rode among his people, his presence a reminder that the Yasa was not just words, but a living force, as real as the wind that shaped the steppe. Bert, ever his confidant, saw the Yasa's power but also its burden. In the quiet of their jur, she spoke softly. A law binds men, but it can also chain them. Be sure it serves the heart as well as the sword. Her words lingered, a reminder that the Yasa's strength lay in its fairness, not just its severity. Genghis listened, adjusting the code to protect the weak, widows, orphans, and the poor, ensuring that his empire was not just a machine of war, but a home for those who followed him. This balance between justice and mercy was what set the Yasa apart from the laws of other empires. The Yasa's impact was profound. It turned a coalition of tribes into a nation, giving the Mongols a shared identity that transcended bloodlines. It brought order to the conquered cities, where merchants and scholars found stability under Mongol rule. It even shaped the empire's wars, as Genghis used the Yasa to discipline his armies, ensuring that their conquests were not marred by chaos. But the code was not without its challenges. In the cities of Central Asia, where Islamic law held sway, the Yasa's decrees sparked resentment. In the steppe, old chieftains grumbled at its strictures, longing for the freedom of the old ways. And within Genghis's family, the Yasa could not fully quell the rivalries of his sons, whose ambitions threatened to unravel the empire's unity. As Genghis stood on the hills above Karakoram, watching the city grow into a capital worthy of his name, he felt the weight of the Yasa. It was his creation, a law that bound his empire as tightly as his Arban units bound his warriors. But it was also a chain, one that demanded his vigilance to maintain. The Jin still resisted in the south, the Zaizia rebelled in the west, and the distant lands of Europe whispered of new challenges. The Yasa had given his empire strength, but it could not shield it from the storms within, storms of family, faith, and the restless hearts of those he ruled. What would happen as Genghis faced the rebellion of the Zaizia and the growing tensions within his empire? As the steppe whispered of trials yet to come, the Khan stood at the crossroads of law and legacy, his heart a battlefield where order and ambition collided. The steppe lay still under a sky ablaze with stars, each a silent prayer to the eternal blue sky, Tengri, the deity that guided Genghis Khan's heart. In his late 50s, with an empire stretching from China to Persia, Genghis was more than a conqueror. He was a man whose spirit was shaped by the steppe's vastness and the beliefs that bound his people. The Mongols revered Tengri, the sky god, whose will was read in the wind and the flight of eagles. Genghis, though a warrior, was deeply spiritual, his conquests driven by a belief that Tengri had chosen him to unite the world. Shamans, with their chants and bone readings, were his bridge to the divine, their omens guiding his campaigns. Yet, his empire embraced many faiths: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, each a thread in the tapestry of his rule. The Yasa, his law, demanded tolerance, a radical decree that allowed mosques and temples to stand alongside Mongol altars. Genghis consulted priests and monks, seeking wisdom to govern his diverse peoples. Bert, his confidant, urged him to listen to all voices. "The sky sees all, but so must you." Her words grounded him, balancing his faith with pragmatism. His spirituality was not rigid. It was a flame that lit his path, giving purpose to his wars and mercy to his rule. But faith could not shield him from doubt. The rebellions of the Zaizia and the rivalries of his sons tested his belief in Tengri's mandate. As he stood on the steppe, feeling the wind's ancient song, Genghis wondered if his soul could bear the weight of empire. The spiritual fire that had forged him now flickered, hinting at trials that would demand not just his sword, but his heart. What would happen as Genghis faced his final campaign, his faith tested by the rebellion of those he had once spared? The steppe's grasses bent under a restless wind, carrying the scent of war to Genghis Khan's camp. In 1226, the Zaizia, once humbled tributaries, rebelled, defying the Khan who had spared their cities. Now in his 60s, Genghis felt the weight of years, but his fire burned undimmed. The Zaizia's betrayal was a wound to his honor, a challenge to the empire he had built. He rallied his Tumens, their hooves a thunder that shook the Gobi, and rode south, determined to crush the rebellion and secure his legacy. The campaign was swift and brutal. Genghis, with Subutai and Talyui at his side, struck the Zaizia's cities with relentless precision. Yinchuan fell, its walls no match for Mongol siegecraft. The Tangut king, trembling, offered tribute, but Genghis, unforgiving, ordered his execution. The Zaizia was absorbed into the empire, its wealth and people bound to the Khan's will. Bert's letters, carried by the Yam, urged mercy. A conqueror is remembered by what he builds, not what he destroys. But Genghis, hardened by betrayal, saw no room for weakness. The campaign took its toll. The desert's heat and the long marches strained Genghis's aging body. He fell ill, his strength waning, yet he rode on, his presence a spark for his warriors. The steppe, his home, seemed to call him back, its winds whispering of rest. As the Zaizia's last strongholds crumbled, Genghis knew his time was short, but his empire stood strong, a testament to his will. What would become of the Khan as his body faltered? His empire vast, but his life nearing its end. The steppe lay quiet under a morning sky, its grasses still as if holding their breath. In 1227, Genghis Khan, the unifier of the Mongols, the conqueror of empires, lay dying in a ger near the fallen Zizia. At 65, his body bore the scars of a life of war, but his eyes still burned with the fire of the steppe. His illness, perhaps from a fall or fever, had come swiftly, and as his family gathered, Bert, his sons, his daughters, he faced the end with the same resolve that had built his empire. Genghis's final moments were spent ensuring his legacy. He named Urgide as his successor, a choice to balance his sons' rivalries. To Bert, he whispered words of love, thanking her for anchoring his heart. To his warriors, he urged unity, his voice weak but commanding. The shamans read the bones, declaring that Tengri welcomed him to the sky. As he drew his final breath, the steppe seemed to pause, its winds silent in reverence. His death was kept secret, his body carried back to the steppe in a hidden procession. Buried in an unmarked grave, as was Mongol custom, Genghis became one with the land he loved. His empire mourned, but his sons and generals vowed to carry his vision forward. The steppe, though quiet, pulsed with the echo of his name. What would become of the empire without its Khan, as his sons faced the challenge of his legacy? The steppe stretched beneath a sky of endless blue, its vastness a mirror of the empire Genghis Khan had forged. His death in 1227 left a void, but his legacy endured, a flame that burned across centuries. The Mongol Empire, spanning from the Pacific to the Caspian, was the largest the world had known, a testament to his vision. The Yasa, his law, held it together, while the Yam messengers and Silk Road trade brought wealth and knowledge to Karakoram. His sons carried his banner forward. Urgide expanded the empire, reaching Europe's edges, while Kublai conquered China, founding the Yuan dynasty. Genghis's daughters, ruling as regents, wove alliances that strengthened the empire. His military tactics, speed, deception, unity, became legend, studied by warriors far beyond the steppe. The Pax Mongolica, a time of relative peace, opened trade routes, blending cultures from east to west. Yet his legacy was not without shadow. The blood of conquest stained his name, cities reduced to ash, lives lost to his ambition. Bert's wisdom, urging mercy, lingered in the empire's governance, but the rivalries of his sons fractured its unity. The steppe, his heart, remained a place of freedom, its winds carrying his story, a tale of a boy who rose from betrayal to become the great Khan, a man whose dreams reshaped the world. As the stars shone above, the steppe whispered, what new legends would rise from the hooves of those who followed?